G'day you mob, how's it going? Welcome to this episode of Aussie English. Today I have an interview episode for your listening pleasure, and I have the absolute honour of chatting with Simon Roper, who is from the UK. You will hear that in his accent. I believe he has a southern UK accent, and he is an archaeology student in Britain, or at least he was at the time that I found his content on YouTube and started binge watching it to learn all about things like Old English and how English has changed. So he has an absolutely fascinating YouTube channel, which you can find if you do a search for Simon Roper. So he's an archaeologist, but he's also interested in linguistics and paleontology and evolution, everything like that. So anyway, I thought I would invite him onto the podcast to have a big, long chat about the history of English, how it's changed from Old English to Middle English to Modern English, why those changes occurred, what it was probably like for the different cultures as they were mixing, and the different words and things that came into English and from where they came. So we sat down and ended up talking for almost 2 hours. So I'm going to split this episode into two. I hope you enjoy it. And without any further ado, I give you Simon Roper. With English changing, we had Old English. Where did it become Middle English and how?
A lot of that is due to the loss of case and gender and things like that. So the definite article, which in Old English was quite complicated, there are lots of different forms, and that's like the word the.
Yep.
For people who don't know what the definite article is, but that just it was at that point that it just reduced to the in almost all dialect. In every dialect I know of, I just say almost all in case there's some fringe dialect I just don't know about. But
someone's going to be in the comments like, yeah, you forgot about this one weird exception with 10 people in the top of Canada.
yeah. I'd like that if Canada had just, like, some corner of Canada had just preserved the whole Old English definite article, like the range of different forms, and everywhere else had just lost everything. But so that the change from Old English to Middle English, a lot of the changes were probably already happening in spoken Old English, had probably been happening in spoken Old English for 200 or 300 years, but text takes a while to catch up with, like, the spoken forms, because people tend to be a bit prescriptivist and a bit kind of what's the word? A bit conservative with their writing, and they tend to disapprove of sort of.
I didn't think that that's how you would have to work it out. You obviously would need to look at text, because you obviously wouldn't have any recordings of anyone speaking. I think, like, anytime I try and teach people about the origins of certain expressions when I'm looking them up, if they're known at all, quite often it'll be, well, this is the earliest it was found in print. You know, which means it was said earlier than that, like the change occurred earlier. Yeah. But so, and you
can never predict really exactly how much earlier. Like, I think as long as people have been saying "I don't give a" and then a word, I think as long as people have been saying that, they must have been saying "I don't give a fuck" or "I don't give a shit," but it just never gets written down because it's a swear word. So, but I don't know.
You don't think about that, right? And how much language is missing from the written, because it's just the context is different. Obviously, spoken English too. The way that I'm talking with you, you would imagine if you were to transcribe this podcast, which I do, but it would be very different from how English would be written in a book, or even 100 years ago. Even if I was speaking the same dialect to someone, it wouldn't necessarily ever appear in written form the same way that it's spoken.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's not even something that really necessarily occurs to people, just how different, for example, the English in an academic journal or just like a book or a novel or something like that is from the English that we speak. Like, it's, to us, it's all the same language, but if we actually analyze it, then it's really very different. So it might be that, sorry.
There you go.
I was going to say, it might be that to an Old English monk or scribe or someone like that, they didn't consider there to be much difference between what they were writing and what they were saying, but in reality there might have been quite a lot of difference.
That's me in Portuguese. There are big things that you would never say when speaking Portuguese, and weirdly enough, an example would be, my wife's from the north of Brazil, so she would use the pronoun tu much more often than você, which is what they would use further south in Rio and Sao Paulo. for you, and you would normally conjugate that in most Latin languages with tu, for example, tu estás. You would put an S on the end of it, tu estás. But with você, they say você está. And so the weird thing is that when speaking, she always says tu está, or not even that. She'll just say tu tá, tu tá. But she'll never she conjugates it with the third person instead of the second. And it's a weird thing when written, it's almost never done that way. And
so do you conjugate it with the normal Romance second person if it's written? Do you just
I think they would. Again, I'm not a native speaker, so you'd have to go through. But there are definitely things. So there are other things like you would use pronouns like le and when writing, but you would never really say that. So if I gave you something, I would say eu te dou alguma coisa, or eu dou para você, I give to you. But when written, quite often they can use other pronouns like le and that they just would never do when speaking. Yeah, and so it's really interesting noticing those big gaps between, because I'll be reading and I'll be like, Kel, can't I just say this? There's this thing here. And she's like, no one would ever say that. It sounds so posh. And you're like, wow, I would never know that if I was just reading Portuguese. I would just be like, this is what you say. Even words, like another one was corpulento, which means like chubby, right? So I was reading Harry Potter, and they were saying something about the Weasley boy being, whatever his name is, the fat kid being fat, and they were using this word corpulento. And I was asking Kel, I was like, what is corpulento? Is that like corpulent or something? Like this sounds like it makes me think of that. And she's like, no one would ever say that. No one would ever say that. I'm like, but it's in the book. And she's like, yeah, you can read it. Yeah. So it's funny how that happens. And that must be the difficult thing with learning these Latin or any of these languages where you literally just have the writing to go off, right?
There's some things in terms of like pronunciation rather than like word choice. There are things like poetic meter can tell you a certain amount about how words were being elided. So for example, in the 1600s in the southeast of England, everybody would often be pronounced everybody, and you can tell that because of the way it's sort of fitted into poetic meter in various poems and things, and you can tell like the stress patterns and things from that. And I think the same is true of Latin as well. Like you can tell that certain things are elided in certain ways. I know Spanish has a kind of thing where if one word ends in a vowel and the next word starts with a vowel, then they kind of get blended together, like hiatus between two vowels. Like so,
one example exactly in Portuguese they do that all the time. So one example would be eu estou indo para a praia, which is I am going to the beach, which fortunately enough in English is like almost a literal translation. Eu estou indo para a praia.
But then that comes out as two syllables when someone actually says it.
They contract the shit out of it. It becomes like, eu tô indo para a praia, eu tô indo para praia, and then tô indo para praia. Like it just gets like squashed down completely, and all these things like they have the definite article and if it's after it's just one sound. And the same thing with like if you have the verb to be, você you'll just say você or se. And so it all just gets crushed together. And we do it in English, right? Like if you were saying,
we do,
what do you want to do? You'll say, what do you want to do? Like it all just gets, it sounds like one big word. And so I always wonder when we hear people saying they're speaking Latin with one another, people who learn Latin or people even in movies that are trying to say, sic a tua ad astra. That was what schools I'm saying, reach for the stars. But when they said it, you always wonder, I can't imagine that would have been how it was spoken, every single syllable perfectly enunciated.
Yeah, no, I think Latin must have had the same kind of, I don't actually know this for a fact, but I think Latin must have had the same kind of rules around it as Spanish in terms of like elision, or Portuguese. Like, I think different languages deal with hiatus in different ways. So like it's a situation where one vowel and another vowel collide in that way.
Yeah.
So like if there's a word ending in a vowel and a word starting with a vowel, like there's an interesting, I can't remember who it's by, I'll try and sort of dig it up. There's an interesting paper about how hiatus might have worked in Old English, because in German I think they deal with hiatus by putting a glottal stop.
Can you explain hiatus? That's the joining of the two sounds, is it? Or the two sounds next to one another?
So hiatus is a situation where one vowel and another vowel occur next to each other in adjacent syllables. So it could be if
Yeah.
a word ends in a vowel and the next one starts with a vowel.
The
Or I
best
think it could also
example could
be,
be in English that we use Y, W, and R to link vowel sounds. So like the
yeah,
elephant
absolutely.
and
Yeah,
what's it?
yeah,
You ask and Australia is.
yeah. That's a fantastic example. Like, everyone always points the linking R thing out, but we do it with the, like as you say, we do it with word and yeah as well, depending on the quality of the vowels involved.
Well, that's
But
a big step in sounding much more natural, learning those things, which is ironically
it
why
is,
so many
yeah,
of my students want to know more about connected speech. They have to almost learn how to sound like a robot when you learn the language, like most people learning a foreign language. And then you kind of have to forget the
yeah.
rules or the official rules and learn
Because you have to,
these subtle pronunciation rules that go on. And it's almost like there's
yeah,
no one, it's weird that there's no committee meeting who decided that we're going to link them with a
yeah,
Y
absolutely.
sound or
Yeah.
whatever. It just gets artificially
Like
just
it's you have to understand the rules in order to break them properly, which is the annoying thing. Because like I know there were, like in my first year at uni, there were a lot of Spanish speakers that I happened to be friends with because one of my flatmates was bilingual English and Spanish. Um, and I told them that when they said library, they didn't have to pronounce it as three syllables. They could just say library because it's a bit of a mouthful if you say
yeah.
library. Nobody really says that. And then they started
February, yeah,
February, yeah,
Wednesday.
exactly. With and they started pronouncing crisps as just crips because they found the sps cluster difficult. And
Uh-huh.
I said, "Oh no, you can't do that. You have to say
No.
crisps."
Or else you mean
Nobody will
something
understand you
completely
otherwise.
different.
Yeah, yeah,
All right. So, what I wanted to get on to, I guess, talking about how English has changed. So we had Old English. We've had the Anglo-Saxons or the Anglo-Frisians came across from sort of the Dutch or Belgium parts of Eastern Europe there into Great Britain and settled and sort of pushed the Celts out, or at least their language became the dominant one in those
yeah,
areas.
yeah,
And then what we had the Norse come through, right? The Vikings through the
yeah,
seven
absolutely,
to
yeah,
nine hundreds,
yeah, yeah.
and then we had the Normans come in, and my mum found out we're related to William the Conqueror. So
Really,
yeah, she's real nut for family history, and once you get into the one royal family somewhere, it pretty much just goes brrr,
yeah, relate
all
to
the
all
way
of them. Yeah.
back. And so we had him come through with was it a French kind of French language? Was it a Norman French language that
Yeah,
came in?
like it. I think it's people sort of refer to Anglo-Norman as the kind of blending of the two, but I think it's like the actual any situations where they actually blended is quite marginal. I think most people just spoke English, and slowly French vocabulary started kind of diffusing
Yeah.
downwards. If you see what I mean.
Yeah, because we've got obviously French. I mean, English is something like 70% French vocab now, but it has a German
It is.
understructure, and the most
Yeah,
frequent words tend to stay. They're all Germanic, I think,
yeah,
the first 200.
absolutely. Yeah,
But so we had that happen, and then I think it just became modern English throughout the 1500s, 1600s is when
yeah,
they had the great vowel shift and it changed. But
yeah. That was sort of the 1500s.
the stuff I was really interested in getting you to chat about was what would life have been like during, say, Danelaw, where we had all of these Norsemen coming over, repeatedly immigrating to Great Britain. What would have been the cultural setup with different languages, and how would that have
That's
blended to make Middle English?
that's a really interesting one. That's actually something I've looked a fair bit at because of the northern kind of dialect that my grandparents speak. I kind of got interested in that kind of Danelaw thing through that, and sort of north and eastern England thing. And I personally think that in say probably the 900s there would have been a lot of bilingualism about, because I think the only way you can get, so for instance in standard English there are a huge amount of Old Norse loanwords in the core vocabulary where there aren't many French loanwords, as you say, and the most common words are mostly Old English, but then also Old Norse. So words like egg and skull and skirt and things like that are all Old Norse loanwords. And in northern dialects, you find more Old Norse loanwords. You find a huge proportion of core vocabulary is Old Norse, and there've been various analyses, most of them done sort of in the late 1800s, trying to work out if there's any kind of pattern. So, for example, if Old Norse words were used for agricultural things, or if Old Norse words were used for landscape things, stuff like that. I can't remember exactly what they found, but I think to have that level of diffusion of Old Norse vocabulary into the core vocabulary of people, you really need like widespread bilingualism. Like not necessarily everyone was bilingual, but people were sort of marrying into families that spoke the other language and things like that, because you have even prepositions in the north of England and in the east of England in Middle English, but not so much in early modern English. You have prepositions like til, which is like the Scandinavian preposition meaning to, as in to go to somewhere. You have the infinitive marker at, which is it's been reduced in a lot of Scandinavian languages. I think in Icelandic is now ad, but it's like the infinitive marker. So
it's the equivalent of to. Yeah.
Yeah, but they're both kind of the equivalent of to in different circumstances. But you have those words in some Northern English dialects into the 20th century, and you have them in like in writing well throughout the Middle English period and throughout the early modern English period. And to have that level of inclusion of that kind of vocabulary, I think you would have had to have had families that were bilingual, families that were teaching their children both languages.
Well, and that's what you would expect, right? That would be the most natural thing. It seems like it's sort of the null hypothesis. If you were to go about it scientifically, would be you would have two different groups here. If they're mixing and they're living in the same areas, you would imagine there's going to be some level of bilingualism. It would be,
absolutely.
I mean, it probably makes more sense for the null hypothesis to really be there's no difference and they both keep separate. But you would imagine that's the more sensical thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like there are people who think that there wasn't actually much actual Scandinavian presence and that it was mostly just landowners and things like that. But I think there must have been. I mean, there's genetic evidence. I think there was quite widespread Scandinavian actual presence of people like immigrants. I think there's some evidence that the animal husbandry practices changed after the Scandinavians arrived. So there were more pigs, there was more fishing, there were more waterfowl and things like that, poultry in general.
That's interesting that there's a big cultural push as well, then, which may have ramifications to the language itself as well and how it's used.
Yeah. Like what was I going to say? That it's weird because there's not really, aside from sites where Scandinavian sort of armies and things camped, there isn't much. It's quite hard to differentiate Anglo-Scandinavian people, like ordinary people, from Anglo-Saxons in the archaeological record, even though there must have been lots of people who spoke Old Norse. The archaeology identifying them as Scandinavian pretty much disappears within 1 or 2 generations. So there are very few sites that are very clearly, these are just Scandinavian people who live in England.
I always find that funny with movies, right? Where you watch the movies and TV shows about Vikings, and they're always like, "How do you know which ones are which?" Oh, the Vikings are the ones with chainmail and leather and the helmets, and the Anglo-Saxons are the boring-looking ones, or something. And you're like,
"Yeah, they're always the boring-looking ones."
I have a feeling they would have all looked the same, like maybe
coloured.
Like
within. I mean, I suppose in terms of like things like hairstyles, I think there's some evidence, literary evidence, that there were sort of typically Scandinavian hairstyles that were worn by royals and things like that were sort of recognized as Scandinavian influence, but those things don't really preserve in archaeology. So things like Scandinavian motifs on tools and things, you don't really get that in the archaeology, because once a tool wears out, you just get a new one from whoever makes them nearby, and those people are, and I think that's more evidence for the kind of the quite rapid diffusion of Scandinavian communities into the wider Anglo-Saxon community, rather than the isolated Scandinavian communities. And I think even from a practical point of view, like particularly upland places like the Yorkshire Dales and the Lake District and places like that, nowadays land management and agricultural management in those places is a very locally managed thing. And from place name evidence, you can sort of tell that Scandinavian communities, or rather places named in a Scandinavian way, were very, very close to places named in Old English. So there was clearly, they would have had to have some level of cooperation.
Well, and if they're farmers, right, you can imagine they're going to be trading with one another.
Yeah,
they're probably going to be marrying one another. They're going to be raising children, speak different languages, have friends in different languages, etc.
Yeah, yeah.
But what was the main difference for the adoption of a great deal of Norse language, but not in terms of Celtic language? Because I think you covered that in one of your videos. Saying that,
yeah, like the lack of inclusion of Celtic. I've always considered doing a video on it, but Langfocus did a decent video on it quite a while ago. But it's it's like there's clearly, from genetic evidence tells us that there was clearly, it wasn't just a population replacement when the Anglo-Saxons arrived.
Yeah.
So why is there so little Celtic influence on English? Like there are very, very few loan words from Celtic languages into English, even in sort of fringe dialects like, dialects in sort of Scotland and Northern England that you would expect to have a load of Celtic vocabulary, because that's where Celtic populations were sort of interacting with English-speaking populations the longest, but they don't. And I don't know why. Like there are certain grammatical constructions that people have linked to maybe Celtic substrate kind of influence. So a load of Celtic language speakers learning Old English and then them kind of
taking the grammar that they know in one language, which is what I would do in Portuguese. If I'm unsure, I'm just going to use English grammar and then see, does that work?
See if it works, yeah. And if entire communities are doing that, of course, then it becomes the standard.
Yeah.
So, but then those constructions tend to appear quite late on in writing, and some people, so like 1500s, 1600s, when really by all rights there should be no one speaking, as far as we know, there should be no one speaking Brittonic anymore anywhere, apart from like
France,
Welsh
right?
speakers. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it's crazy, because I think I looked up some of these words. I think we've got Scottish Gaelic can, which is why we call the place Cairns up in the north of Australia, right? It's like a burn, I think you would say too. A burn's probably a word that we get from them, where it's like a kind of like a sand dune or a hill, right? And then trousers, claymore, bog, galore, shindig, slogan, spunk, whiskey. And then Irish Gaelic ones like banshee, gob, as in mouth, and then hooligan and limerick and leprechaun, slew, slob, and smithereens. I was like, okay, so we do have some. But
there's like a smattering, but it's not generally the words you'd use. It's a really weird collection of words, because it's like it's not prestige words, like it's not words to do with royalty or government or anything like that. But it's not words that I would use a lot. But I don't know. Like they seem like all vocabulary words, like they seem like words you'd use on an everyday basis, but they're just not. I don't really know how to characterize them really.
Well, and then we had the invasion of William the Conqueror in 1066, where he's brought over. I guess it's sort of an archaic version of French today, and that's where we get the majority, I would imagine, of our French loan words, especially the ones that are spelt differently. But you're like what's a good example? Probably, as opposed to the French probablement. That it's spelt differently, so I can see, okay. And like any of those words, like confiscate in French is probably something like confisqué or something, like where they've added a t to the end or removed it. But what happened then once William the Conqueror came over? How did that affect English, and how did the French enter English? Because it was a different process, right? Because all of a sudden you had the upper class with that language, as opposed to the lower or middle class farmers that were the Scandinavian speakers blending the languages together. Yeah,
I think I don't know much about the exact process that it happened, but I could only guess that it was sort of, successively lower kind of class people picking up the language, picking up the French, because they wanted to sort of,
emulate the rich.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think we got it for things like the church, government, law, royalty, food, and that's why in English we have beef and cows. You'll have different words for the animals, but the meat's a different word. It's a French word, because it tended to be that was how the royalty or the rich people interacted with those animals. It was they were dead and on the plate.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's part of the thing that people. I think I said that people were trying to analyze the Scandinavian element in certain dialects, and whether it was land use or whether it was, and I think that was based on the idea that that the French loan words that we have tend to be to do with certain aspects of life. So as you say, like eating meat or government or royalty or, things like that. Although, of course, there are French words in the core vocabulary, like people I think people is a French word, or a French derived word. I could be wrong, actually, but I think
it is. You would say peuple, but you would say it for people as in a people. And you would
right.
say for
Okay.
like, hey, people, it would be gens, I think, more so than
okay.
peuple. Peuple would be like the group of people.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think that's the only French loan word I'm aware of that's extremely everyday. But no, there's bound to be more than that. But yeah, no, I assume it was just like diffusion from the upper classes to the lower classes. And then after that, it's just, sorry.
No, you get. Well, I was going to say, what's the next step then to get to modern English? So we've come through where the French came in, and we had 500 or so years of Middle English, and then we have what the sort of great vowel shift is the marker where we suddenly get into modern English, and that's sort of is that where Shakespeare was writing? Right at that, was he speaking Middle English or modern English?
Modern English,
so it's just afterwards, is it?
Just after the Great Vowel Shift, yeah. And the Great Vowel Shift probably happened. Well, it definitely happened in different ways in different places. So there was a different kind of Great Vowel Shift in the south than in the north of England. And then at the point Shakespeare was writing, I think you could probably take a sort of West Country dialect from 100 years ago and compare it with, if you had a recording of someone speaking in the early 1600s, it'd be a toss up. Like they'd be so not similar, but one wouldn't be obviously older than the other. Like I think beyond that point, it's just a kind of diversification into the English dialects we have today, and there's not much kind of linear progression as much as there is diversification after that point. From our perspective, I mean, there's always been diversification, but from our perspective in writing, because we've only really seen the sort of formal standard, it's been more of a linear progression. But at that point, it's just like, I mean, that's kind of the point that American English starts to split off. And then, of course, later on, like late 1700s, early 1800s, you have Australian English splitting off, which is interesting because like there are some recordings of people speaking their regional dialects from, I think, the 1910s, which I could send you some of to link in the description or something if you wanted. And that, like, I listened to ones from sort of there were none from, I couldn't find any from London. There probably were some from London, but the ones from the southeastern coast of England, like sort of Essex and Norfolk area, they sounded remarkably Australian to me, like in terms of vowel qualities and things like that. And I think like early, not linguists, but early people writing on the dialects of Australia in sort of the 1820s, 1830s actually commented that they'd started to diversify. By that point, they'd started to diverge from British English, but they had a clearly significant London element. So I think,
well, it's an interesting story. A really good book that's worth getting that you might like is the Story of Australian English. I don't know if you've seen that one.
I've not seen that one.
He talks about how it got here. So, you have the middle / upper class gentry who are the ones bringing the convicts out here, the people like Arthur Phillip, who was the first governor of New South Wales, and all of his soldiers. But then the majority of them tend to be obviously convicts, most of which I believe were Cockney. So they were from southeast England, around London and those areas, Devon and everything else. And they were the lower class, so they would have had the Cockney English that they spoke, as well as flash language that they talk about, which is the sort of thieves' language, all the slang that they used that was related to stealing and the underworld, effectively, that they brought over. And then you also have a whole bunch of Irish, a whole bunch of Americans, and I think you even had 12 African descent convicts that were brought over. And so there's this huge mix. And I was looking into it and just thinking, how amazing must it have been the first generation of quote unquote Australians, at least European Australians that got here, and watching them develop their own dialect of English, because you literally have, a small population of, I think, about 2,000 people in a very small area, and they all speak with different accents, or at least all the adults that were brought there later in life, and the kids have to kind of work out we're all the
How
next
am I supposed to
generation.
speak?
Well, we're all born. We're all, and you know what kids are like at schools, right? You end up with your own slang words, your own jokes.
Yeah,
The in group is usually the children. They blend with their parents a little bit, and they get a bit of influence, I would imagine, language wise. But I would say that the majority of the way in which I speak is probably a result of my peer group at school,
same.
at
Yeah,
university, than it is my
yeah,
parents per se. And so imagine how much that first generation, especially, would have really changed.
yeah. It must, like, I think that's the thing is, because it really surprised me to read the the thing about um, the thing about people noticing by the 1820s that there had already started to be a divergence. But it makes sense because a lot of the time where you get a lot of linguistic diversity, that happens because there are people of so many different language varieties meeting each other. I
Yeah.
think multicultural London English is a good example of a similar thing where people from lots of different speech communities meet, and among the younger generation who sort of all go to school together and mix together,
Yeah.
you get this dialect produced where you can't even tell what comes from where. Like you can't tell which bit comes from which original language variety, but there's clearly influence from all of them, and I imagine it being something like that. Like the dialect, 2 or 3 generations down the line must have been something very, very interesting.
Well, the
But it's just,
thing that I found interesting is that I think there's a linguistic process called leveling, where all the extremes of the different dialects and languages get sort of pushed out, and they disappear, and they kind of converge on a
yeah,
sort of center around which it's just the most common sounds, I guess you would have. Like if you had one Scottish person and the other 100 are from some obscure town in England, you would imagine that their
yeah,
children are not going to sound like Scots.
yeah, absolutely. I think the
But
same thing happened in Old English, like when all the continental dialects came over, there seems to have been a leveling, and then the dialects diversified from there. But what were you saying? So
Well, the interesting thing I think with Australia and the dialect and how it developed is that you would have had all these people in very, very small colonies, at least in the first 50 years or so, and yet you would have had a constant stream of new people coming in almost on a yearly basis.
yeah,
And so I think that's why you'll have this interesting outsider perspective on Australia in history, because you'll have all these British people coming over, whether they're convicts themselves or they're landowners and free settlers that are educated and were writing diaries and stuff, that could note
yeah,
on, holy crap, we were out here 20 years ago or something
yeah.
and it was completely different, or
And
we
now
were
it just sounds
told that it was
completely,
something different. Yeah, and that must have been changing
yeah,
so quickly. But the
yeah,
one thing that I don't know how much you know about, but I would love to know more about why slang is such a big thing in Australian culture than, say, American or Canadian. I think it's a big thing in British culture, so it's probably tied there to some degree. But I know that,
I would say, from my experience, it's more of a thing in Australian culture.
yeah,
But then I don't know about every aspect of British culture. But like I've experienced a lot more with Australians, like on digs and things, than I have with British people. And it's a massively interesting thing. I mean, you talked about and this is just me sort of guessing. I've got no idea, but you talked about the kind of thieves' language, and the culture of kind of having ever-changing slang it might stem from something like that, like a sort of a need to have a kind of common language
identity.
that the in-group understands and the out-group doesn't understand, a kind of deliberate.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
I think
and
Irish
you'll
families
notice
have a similar
Australians
thing
do
like
that.
that.
Australians will put on the accent a bit more, and they probably end up using slang more. Slang more. You're going to hear people, as soon as I get to America or something, you're probably going to hear me say, "G'day, how's it going?" a lot more than I would
Yeah,
here,
yeah,
because it's kind of like, "Hey, I'm different. Know where I'm from." Any other Australians out there?
mm,
Like,
yeah, like a sort of beacon.
yeah. So it is so funny how it all works. But the last question I sort of had for you, because we've been rolling on for a bit, but what has
Okay, so
maintained the dialects in Great Britain in the age of the internet? Well, following the telegraph, as soon as you had TV and everything like that, and there's a lot of mixing of dialects, and you're getting exposed from everywhere. What's maintained the diversity of dialects that you have in such a small island?
I think they've been leveled to quite a large extent, because I think 100 or so years ago, there was probably a lot less mutual intelligibility between dialects, partly because people weren't hearing each other's dialects as much, and partly because they genuinely just were quite different from each other. But recently, linguistic influence often happens as a kind of spread out from central points. So there are kind of waves out from, for example, from London. There are kind of waves of influence that spread out. And I think that's definitely happened between my granddad's generation, my dad's generation, and my generation. There's been, people ignoring Scotland, because I think I can't. They're just off in their own bloody world. But I think within England, the kind of fringe dialects, like Cornish dialects and Welsh, English-speaking Welsh dialects and Cumbrian dialects and Yorkshire dialects, Geordie dialects and things like that, have seemed to be the last ones who haven't quite been fully impacted by this recent wave of sort of London or at least southeastern dialects. Because in a lot of the north of England, until relatively recently, for example, the vowels in stone and name were monophthongs. So stone was something like stone, depending where you were. Name was something like name. And that's that kind of thing still exists in Cumbria. People of my generation that I've met at university still have those kinds of vowel qualities. People in Yorkshire have those kinds of vowel qualities. The people in Newcastle are doing their own bloody thing.
You impersonate their accent, or
Storn, name, no. But people in, for example, Manchester, where those vowels would have been monophthongal until quite recently. People of my age in Manchester pronounce them as diphthongs now because of this wave of London influence, and it's something that's I think there has been a big levelling. I think there'll continue to be a big levelling, unless maybe there's some weird movement to preserve regional dialect or something. Which,
do you think it's something that should actively be preserved, or do you think you just sort of let it go the way of the dodo, because language is language and it's really there for a purpose, which is communication, not necessarily as a social badge?
I think it's interesting to, as from a linguistic perspective, it's just interesting to record it. I would like if there was more diversity, just because it would be more interesting from a linguistic perspective. It would be cool to kind of, and I think people would see value in there being, and they're having their own local identity. I hope it wouldn't cause too much kind of in-group, out-group kind of aggression. I don't see why it would, but it would be nice if they were preserved. But if people don't want to preserve them, then they won't be preserved. That's the thing. If people don't see it as important, then it won't. Then it's.
I tend to be surprised that it's held on for so long, right? Because you would imagine that it's still, I think it must still be a big thing in Britain for your accent says something about who you are, where you're from. And it's something that you can show, straight away. So you can either lose it if you don't want it, but if you are proud of where you're from and want people to know that, that's a reason you might conserve it, I guess, too, especially if you grow up in a small community for the first 10 years of your life, and that kind of solidifies, and then only later do you start traveling around.
Yeah, and then you start, I suppose, tailoring your accent to whatever's convenient, I suppose, because it's, as you say, it's a tool for communication. It's a tool for expressing who you are, and you might not want to be a certain person. If people in a certain area just don't want that aspect of their identity anymore, then I think it's their right to kind of shed it. But I think there's nothing wrong with.
It's interesting it hasn't happened more with, say, the Manchester accent or the Newcastle accent or Liverpool, where, for those who don't know, I guess they have the kind of stigma of being a lower class, working class cities in Great Britain, as opposed to somewhere like London, where you would have more received pronunciation, the posh accent. And so you would imagine if it was going to happen, those would be the first places to be like, all right, well, we can just change our accent, and now we don't have the negative association with being from these areas or whatever.
Yeah, but it's an interesting one, actually. Because as you say, Scouse accents and Geordie accents are preserved very, very well. Mancunian accents, I think, maybe less well, but still very well. I think it might kind of be that they are, in some sense, their own cultural centres in the same way that London is. So
Yeah.
they probably have, like, I know Scouse has influenced surrounding like Merseyside and Wirral dialects, and there are people in northern Wales, northeastern Wales that speak with what are basically Scouse accents.
Really?
Just from that influence, and it's clearly something that's come from the city, because a lot of features of Scouse are very obviously Irish, sort of come from Irish features like lenition and things like that, certain vowel qualities, which comes from migration to Liverpool. So it's clearly an outward wave that's spread. I don't know much about that in terms of Manchester, or I think Newcastle pretty much that's just a variation of the northeastern kind of dialect continuum. I don't know that that's like a wave of influence situation, but yeah, it might just be because they're their own kind of centers of influence, but I don't really know what makes something a center of influence. So I don't know if that's meaningful. I don't know.
Well, lastly, where do you see English in, say, 500 years? What do you think will happen in terms of its usage and say, dialects around the world? Do you think that because we'll obviously become all the more connected than we are today, is that going to erode differences, or will it amplify them?
I don't know. That's really interesting. I think while there are sort of broad levelings of dialects, for example, as I say, in the UK, there's been a kind of levelling of dialects in the northern US, and also in the southern US, there's been kind of levelings of dialects there. I think very large dialect areas are maintaining their distinctions, or maybe even becoming more distinct from each other. So I think whether language will stay, English will stay the kind of global lingua franca that it is at the moment, I don't know. That just depends on what the political situation is. But I don't know. I think they'll carry on diversifying. I think language will find a way to diversify. It'd be interesting to see where Australian English goes, because it's a relatively young variety that's already diversified into all of the versions of Australian English that exist today. So it'd be interesting to see how that carries on.
Well, the interesting thing with Australian English is that it kind of differs, but not really geographically. So, I mean, geographically in a sense that you won't necessarily go to a different town and they'll have a different dialect or accent from the next town, but it'll be more based on not class, but potentially education, which isn't necessarily
kind of situation.
Well, you'll notice, I've even noticed with myself that if you were to put me next to someone who's, say, a tradesperson, a tradie in Australia, and we came from the same original town, because I went through a private school and then I went to university and I was there for 12 years with a lot of foreigners, and I traveled overseas and did a bunch of other things where I wasn't just in my little group of people that I worked with since I was 16 or something. You'll notice a big difference between how broad my accent is compared to theirs, and we live in the same place. We're from the same place ultimately.
Yeah. But would you say theirs would be broader then?
Yeah, 100%. Usually, it would be more broader than mine.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's so hard to know whether that's an education thing or it's an upbringing thing. But then also, if you go out into rural areas, potentially again because of the isolation aspect, where you have a smaller group of native speakers that don't tend to be mixing with a lot of immigrants or with people from elsewhere around the world, as you would in the middle of Melbourne or Sydney, they tend to all sort of homogenize into a broader sort of accent. But it's interesting how it happens in Australia, but we haven't had the same thing happen like with America, where geographically the accents are actually much more distinct.
Yeah, like I'd wondered about the variation, because I knew, like, people have talked to me about the kind of socio-lect thing before, like the class.
That's eroding. Everyone's moving now from the cultivated. I think if they were already a very small class of people that kind of sounded like received pronunciation from Britain with a little sort of Aussie twang, or vice versa, Australian with a British twang, but they tended to be the upper rich class from places like Sydney. But I think nowadays, because of our culture, with everyone sort of wanting to be seen as they want to bring the tall poppies down as opposed to bring themselves up above everyone else. So you'll have prime ministers using slang, swearing, trying to put on a broad accent because they're trying to show that they're like everyone else. We don't have that kind of royal class where they would be like, oh, we have to prove that we are above the plebs. So, it's different. And so, yeah, I think there is this shift away from the cultivated accent, if that's even a good way of explaining it linguistically today, but they're more general. But you'll still see if you drive for a few hours out into farm areas, like places where it's rural, you'll probably notice it's a broader accent. It's more nasally. So they'll be like speaking up here in the nose a bit more and, hey, how's it going? Yeah, not bad. That sort of thing is a lot more obvious. They'll probably even use a lot more slang as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, it'll be so interesting.
Their own slang or just slang that's common to everyone?
I think a bit of both. They probably have their own in terms of things. It would be stuff that I'd recognize, but I just wouldn't use. Like I wouldn't refer to women as Sheilas, which is ironically, it's an Irish word. And I found out it's actually apparently Irish from Latin. It comes from Latin originally as a name that went into Celtic and then went into English, Sheila. Yeah, but so you might.
I always associate it with Australia.
Yeah, no, it's Irish. I think we got it from the Irish convicts that came over here.
Right.
But yeah, so like Sheila, and ironically, a really weird thing, if you want to sort of talk about that, we have two of those, right? We have like Sheila and bloke. I'll use bloke all the time. I will not use Sheila all the time.
Would you think it was offensive to use Sheila, or would it just not be something that was right? Okay.
But again, it depends who you're around. If you're in a rural area and the women are used to being called Sheila and it's not a derogatory, nasty thing that they hear, then it's a fine thing to do, right? Like if you're hanging out with your mates and you call one of them a cunt or something, and the context is telling you, okay, that's it. Well, and that's what people listening to the podcast are going to be like, wow, Pete, you just said that. And it's like, yeah, but I actually use that quite a lot in the right context with friends.
Yeah.
Exactly. But then if I'm out of that context, I won't. And so I think it's the same thing with Sheila. If you were to go to those places, or even, swearing a lot more, you go and hang out with tradies in Australia. You walk past tradies in the street and you'll hear them swearing like a trooper. Like it'll be C-bombs, F-bombs, S-bombs. And it's not necessarily that they're trying to harm someone, but it's just a different cultural thing, I guess, that in that context, it's okay. Yeah. But
there was a dig we did with the university with people from ANU in Canberra.
Oh, cool.
And children would visit, like parents with their children would visit the site, and we'd have to remind them to
tone it down.
Yeah. But it was,
yeah, well, it is interesting, the stuff in Australia. I think, have you been here?
No, I'd never been. I'd like to go to visit those people.
I imagine
or something like that.
It'd be sort of
Canberra's not the place to visit, apparently, but
we lived there for about a year and a year, and it's beautiful, but it's also a bit of a shithole. Like, no offense, anyone from Canberra. It's amazing in terms of infrastructure. Everything is beautiful, but it's in the middle of nowhere. There's no beaches. There's no forests. There's not really that much to do. Yeah. And so Kel, my wife, absolutely loved it there, had a great time. I was sort of like, I'm lonely. I have no friends here. I have no family here. Sydney's 7 hours. Melbourne's 7 hours. The beach is 3 hours. The snow is 3 hours. So I was like, this is just in the middle of nowhere. But it will be interesting if you ever come to Australia. We'd have to do a podcast to see how you would view it, because I would imagine you would see it as kind of like Twilight Zone. Like, this feels like England but different. Like, it's like they're especially in places where there's a lot of European descent people, you'd be like, this is almost like it's a different planet. A different country,
England, but it's a different terrain or something.
Go to Tasmania. Tasmania is apparently where all of the Australians go to feel like they're in Britain. So
really,
it's nice. The same sort of weather. Yeah. Anyway, oh man, we've been chatting for ages, but I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on, mate. We've got lots that we can talk about in the future. Oh, my pleasure. Where can people find out more about you?
Oh, just YouTube, really. Like, it's just. I don't even know what my URL is, but
Simon Roper on YouTube.
Yeah, like, or just type it in. But
I'll be sure to link it.
Well, thank you.
I think if you just type in Old English, guys speaking Old English, one of your videos would probably come up, right?
Yeah, I think it would. Hopefully, I don't know, but yeah, no, it's been fantastic. Thank you. It's been very, very interesting. Like. We need to talk about like evolutionary biology more at some point, because that's something I'm really interested in and know pitifully little about beyond just the paleo.
It's hard. I even feel like I've fallen off the wagon in terms of being in the know, because it's been now 3 years since I've. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think you stay in your lane. You kind of like, I was very, very, all the papers I was reading was about evolution of, Australian animals, rats, of very specific things. And then you forget that there's kind of this broad, like,
Oh,
there's all this,
yeah.
other parts of evolution. I would love to get back into it and learn more about it, but I'm just sort of going down the rabbit hole of teaching Australian English and trying to teach
Yeah,
culture and
that's all right.
history and everything like that as well. So it's hard to
Yeah.
balance it.
Yeah,
But
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, definitely. Well, you're more than welcome back on anytime, man. It's been a pleasure.
For that. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.